Good afternoon and welcome to another Waukegan History Museum Lunch and Learn. My name is Ty Rohrer. I'm Manager of Cultural Arts for the Waukegan Park District and also work on behalf of the Waukegan Historical Society. Today's story is really about the start of Waukegan becoming a big city. It is about the early formings of Waukegan's industrial era, and it starts with the sugar refinery. To help tell today's story, I have invited Josh Bill, president of the Waukegan Historical Society, to assist. I know for me personally, I've never really studied much on the sugar refinery, even though it is such a pivotal story in Waukegan. I have always had historian Ed Link and Josh to cover the bases on the sugar refinery for me. But with Ed's passing earlier this year, kind of need to start looking more into certain things like the sugar refinery. And again, really we have to credit Ed for today's story because we're using so much of his extensive research and writings to piece together the saga of the sugar refinery for you all today. So Josh, welcome. And how did you get hooked on the sugar refinery?
Well, thank you, Ty. I'm happy to be here. And I would have to give a nod to Ed as well. I don't remember exactly how it happened. I know I was working with Lake Forest College at that time on a grant that had partnered with the Waukegan Historical Society. And through that, I met Ed, and he brought up the sugar refinery after I had expressed some interest in industrial history. I grew up in New Hampshire, Manchester, New Hampshire, which is an industrial city as well. And I got hooked immediately by the sugar refinery story, and as everybody's going to tell throughout this presentation, there's all sorts of interesting and interconnected facets. And really, what I fell in love with was the fact that it was a really attractive topic for students of mine at Waukegan High School. At the time, I was teaching world history, and I brought Waukegan into a world history classroom through the Industrial Revolution. Students completed a project with the sugar refinery at the center, and they took on various roles. And some of those roles were factory workers, management of the factory, and also some of those roles were victims of explosions and people complaining about pollution as well. So there's no shortage of intrigue with this story, and I'm happy to help you tell it.
Well, let's get into it. So Waukegan's industrial age beginning in 1890 would see the population grow as people started to come from all over the world for these available jobs. So in 1890 we have 4,915 residents, and really Waukegan had not grown much since the 1870s. In 1900 there are 9,426, so you can see it double in those 10 years after the industries start to show up. By 1910, it's risen to 16,000. 1920, it's 19,000, and then a big jump in 1930 with 33,499 residents. So as Waukegan grows, as do the industries, or vice versa. And really, everything just keeps rising from there. And this all starts with the arrival of the first major industry to Waukegan, the United States Sugar Refinery. But for the industries to come, a few things had to happen prior. Really, there were three key factors. The first was congressional support for improvements of the Waukegan harbor starting in the early 1880s. The improved harbor allowed for better access for commercial shipping. The next factor was the election of Henry C. Hutchinson, elected mayor of Waukegan. Now, Hutchinson was a businessman who believed that business and politics did not mix, and he refused to run for mayor. Hutchinson had many supporters, though, and while he was away for an extended time in Iowa, well, his supporters decided to start campaigning on his behalf, even though he had not approved this. Amazingly, when Hutchinson returns from Iowa to Waukegan, he finds out that he is elected mayor. After some persuasion, He finally accepts the position. He sells his business, and he gets to work with the plan of turning Waukegan's lakefront into a manufacturing center. And this brings us to the third factor, the Beltline Railroad, later known as the EJ&E. Now Hutchinson finds out that the Beltline Railroad was planning to extend from Chicago into Lake County, but the end of the line was going to be Highland Park, some 20 miles south of Waukegan. Somehow, unbeknownst to us historians, Hutchinson convinced the railroad to move the terminus up to Waukegan. So with the problem of transportation settled, Hutchinson now focused on reeling in that first big fish, a large industry to come to Waukegan to spark others to follow. This first industry was the U.S. sugar refinery. First, we kind of need to figure out what a sugar refinery is. The name itself is a little deceiving. It really would be better to call it a corn refinery because that's what it's really doing. Refining corn to turn it into sugar or glucose. So refining corn. Starch, which constitutes 55% of the corn kernel, and we're getting a little technical here, can be converted into a variety of products for dietary and industrial uses. As found in corn, potatoes, or any other vegetable, starch consists of small, round, white, hard grains, tasteless, and insoluble in cold water. But hot water converts it into a soluble, sticky, from which may serve for starching clothes or making cornstarch pudding. Carrying the process further with the aid of a little acid or other catalyst, it takes up water and goes over into a sugar dextrose, commonly called glucose. So they're refining corn basically to make glucose, but they also were doing some other things there, refining the corn for animal feed and things like that too.
And I was chuckling over here because my students, this is one of the things that confuses them a lot. So they get newspaper articles from the time, and the newspapers call the refinery something different, almost with every article. Now, part of that was name changes of the factory, but sometimes it's called the sugar refinery, and then other times it's called the corn products refining company. Students think that that's a different thing, but in fact, it's as Ty explains, it's all part of the real process that was happening in Waukegan. And as some of his terminology might have suggested, that's part of what became dangerous about this process. There were lots of, I have no idea about science, but there was lots of scientific things happening that proved to be dangerous to this sort of work.
We should have had Mr. Cosgrove join us,
We
right?
should have, yeah, absolutely.
He could have helped us with the science. Now, I'm going to tell some of the story here of the sugar refinery. There's a lot here. Not going to cover all that. We don't know it all, too. It's very murky. There are a lot of different companies that own the sugar refinery over a period of time, lots of different names, but we'll get through this the best we can. Kind of start at the beginning. So the man to build the sugar refinery, he was actually already living in Waukegan. When Hutchinson is elected, the train decides to come to Waukegan, things like that. His name was Thomas Jebb, and he owned the Rose Malt Works in Waukegan. And he had wanted to build a corn processing plant, but was unable without the rail line. He acted quickly as the railroad was being completed. He filed incorporation papers for the U.S. Sugar Refinery with the state of Illinois on November 29, 1889. The other incorporators were B.W. Browning, J.A. Holzbauer, and Mayor Hutchinson. Hutchinson had one share of stock, and we're pretty sure that this would be seen as a conflict of interest today. Now, the refinery opened in the spring of 1890. It consisted of 4 buildings and equipment that cost $500,000 to build and put together. The main processing building was brick. It was 4 to 6 stories high and covered 65,000 square feet of land. This building had the wet starch process, milling, filtering, 16 boilers, and 25 pumps in it. And the pumps brought in water from Lake Michigan that was 800 feet away from the refinery. Another building was used for drying the cattle feed and contained dry mills for grinding. The third building was a warehouse, and the fourth was the office. And the train came daily to the refinery, bringing supplies and hauling away product. 100 tons of coal per day were needed, and 10,000 bushels of corn was the daily capacity. So the 10,000 bushels of corn brought in daily for that as well. Hundreds of people started working right away at the sugar refinery, and the community was starting to build up as a result. After only 1 year, though, the sugar refinery shut down, and we're not really sure why. Our history of the sugar refinery over the next few years is, again, a little bit murky. But by the mid-1892, the U.S. Starch Works opens operations immediately north of the sugar refinery. Starch Works were known as the Upper House, and the sugar refinery was known as the Lower House. So the Starch Works was built to the north, and the sugar refinery that you're seeing in the picture here was south of the Starch Works. Confused now? We are too. We're not really sure who was operating the Starch Works in these early days and what they were making, but in June 1892, they put out a call for hiring 250 more employees, and many of the new employees turned out to be women. But the Starch Works closed as well not long after. Then the sugar refinery and starch works were mostly idle for the next few years, but this ends with an announcement in December 1897 in the Waukegan Daily Sun: "Refinery will run." It would run, but the announcement was a little optimistic because it took another year for it to happen. Jeb, who still owned the sugar refinery, got it back up and running. Hutchinson, who was no longer mayor at that point, was also helping. The main goal seems to have been to get the sugar refinery up and running to be able to sell it. The plan worked, and the sugar refinery was sold to the American Glucose Refining Company, which was led by C.M. Warner. Warner started operations in Waukegan again. This was in December of 1898. But he started the operations under the old name, the United States Sugar Refinery. Now, what about working at the sugar refinery? The first recorded accident and injury of note occurred on February 11th, 1899. Now, it seems hard to believe that there were no accidents prior, but this is what they claimed. The February 11th, 1899 accident was an explosion which severely injured worker Henry Kamen. Now, it seems that smaller incidents were not reported. Newspapers also would have only caught wind of the major accidents. Also, many of the workers were immigrants speaking different languages, and this might have prevented some publicity as well. Unfortunately, the February 11th, 1889 explosion was only the first of many. Several explosions and fires occurred following a similar pattern, which was sparks in a dry, stock-filled room. Starch particles, when concentrated in the air within a confined area, are very volatile. These accidents happen many times with the company, and they do little to improve things during that time too. For the workers, there really was no legal recourse from getting injured on the job. Risks were just assumed for certain jobs. Some lawsuits were filed, but they were not won. Now, the company itself did keep $5,000 insurance policies on the workers. Now, if someone was killed on the job, money would be paid to the company, but not to the victim's family. The company, though, when rebuilding after a fire or explosion, would rebuild using the most modern and efficient firefighting systems. So we at least have to give them credit for that. The sugar refinery did have its own small fire department too, so clearly there were concerns of fires and accidents. For the next few months, in 1899, things were going well. There were small accidents still to some workers, but business was booming. The United States Sugar Refinery had around 300 employees, and they were grinding 13,000 bushels of corn daily. They were producing 800 barrels of glucose from that. Animal feed made there was also being shipped around the United States and also out to Europe. Shortly before noon, on May 14, 1899, a fire alarm was sounded. Within 5 minutes, the fire was out of control. For a time, it was thought that the entire complex would be destroyed. Two things saved the plant that day. The wind changed, stopping the flames from spreading to other buildings, and master mechanic Robert Colville redirected steam from the boilers to act as a steam wall barrier to stop the fire from spreading. The feed house was destroyed, though, and 2 workers died. No other injuries were reported, but there had to be many. A quick investigation returned the verdict of accidental death for the 2 men. The sugar refinery was shut down, though, as it had to rebuild. Most workers were now unemployed, and this took a toll on the community as well, as the economy dropped locally. By late 1899, the sugar refinery was running again, but now we start to see labor unrest. 15 starch shovelers demanded a raise from $2 to $2.50 per day. And they quit. They went on strike to force their demand. The raise was refused, though, and the sugar refinery brought in replacement workers. This angered the striking workers, and they attacked the replacement workers. Some replacement workers were severely beaten before the police arrived. Other workers would try similar tactics, but they all failed. This was prior to the establishment of labor unions. The turn of the century saw prosperity, more labor unrest, and more fires. The sugar refinery is also looking to expand, and by then we're already employing 450 people. In November 1900, the very highly respected and regarded Carl Morton was elected president of the sugar refinery to succeed C.M. Warner. Carl Morton caught a cold, though, on December 31st, and he died 7 days later on January 7, 1901. So he was not on the job long. Many thought that Carl was really going to improve the sugar refinery, and in fact he had, not necessarily in the capacity of president, but in his capacity prior to being elected to that position. Now the concern around town was who was going to follow him. And the sugar refinery turned to Carl's brother, Joy Morton. Joy worked in banks and railroads. He had founded the Morton Salt Company, and even later he established the Morton Arboretum in Lisle, Illinois. But here we start to see some problems in the realm of pollution, and these are things that Joy has to deal with.
So this is one of the places where I pick up with my students, and it's part of the places where we really have a lot of evidence about what's going wrong with the sugar refinery. Ty did a great job of summarizing those early years where the evidence and the records of what's happening, fires, mishaps, industrial accidents, would have been scarce at best. But in 1901, November of 1901, complaints started to mount in a more official capacity, I believe, than they had in the past. I think the complaints about pollution were probably already there, but in 1901, residents all throughout Waukegan started to protest the smoke, holding meetings with city and factory officials and demanding that something be done about the refinery. And you can see here is a letter to the mayor of Waukegan, and it overviews a list of complaints. And while you can probably see it on your screen, I wanted to read their complaints specifically. They're about a little more than halfway down the page. It says, first, whenever the works are running, there's an intolerable stench carried by the wind in whatever direction it blows. The stench is often intense enough to drive people into their houses. Second, the large volume of smoke coming out of the low chimneys settles wherever it is carried by the wind and makes everything exposed to it grimy. Third, the sewerage running into the lake rots along the shore, poisons the air, and is a serious danger to public health by contaminating the lake water. And then that complaint is signed by quite a lengthy list, actually, of people, a lot of political figures in town. The inventor, Edward Ahmet, is on that list, and many other people as well, known and unknown. That same year, complaints started to rise from people of Lake Forest as well, mostly about the water, but some did complain about the stench. This prompted Refinery President Joy Morton to launch an investigation that involved the State Board of Health and Waukegan city officials. The State Board of Health described Waukegan's water as notoriously bad and unnatural lake water. The court proceedings filed by, eventually there were proceedings filed by Lake Forest, and in those proceedings it revealed that 8 million gallons of sewage had been dumped into the lake since the factory's inception. Interestingly, one of the signers of the petition, we found a real gem of an artifact in our files on the sugar refinery, which is a diary entry from George Wheeler. We don't know much about George Wheeler besides this diary post, but in case my students couldn't read this letter because it's in cursive, but if I'll read it to you because it's quite interesting and provides insight on the factory as well. It's dated January 16th, 1905. He begins by saying, "Fine winter day, sleighing good. Notice of Mrs. Authitz, I don't know if that's correct, death in today's paper. The lake water is bad. The papers say it comes from the intake pipe of the old sugar refinery. The water smells just as the old refinery smells. M is drinking from the artesian well, and the rest of the family from Glen Flora. Have had the Glen Flora water for more than 2 years." I think several things are fascinating, and this is the fun of studying history, because you can get a document like this that's quite short and you can draw lots of conclusions. First, I think it's funny he's calling it the old refinery. I call the controversial coal plant the old coal plant because it's old. It's 100 years old. The refinery had only been around at this point for 15 years. So that's an interesting choice of words. And then it provides insight on the mineral springs and other sources of water in the city, which is also quite interesting and has an intriguing history. But I think foremost on Wheeler's mind, as well as everyone else, whether they be in Waukegan or Lake Forest, was that quality of water that was the city's drinking water. So factory management here did everything they could, at least they said they did everything they could, to make the situation look better, even inviting the newspapers from town for a tour of the factory. The Waukegan Daily Sun clearly wanted the factory to stick around, and they did all it could to convince people to support the factory regardless of any pollution. And I'll just read a segment from a newspaper article that's dated in early November 1901. It says, "It's an obvious fact that where there's manufacturing going on, there must be some visible and invisible signs. They are usually smoke and odor. It would be very much pleasanter if all this could be avoided. But while one of the Waukegan men said yesterday, personally, I don't care whether the factory runs or not, the city of Waukegan certainly feels different. To Waukegan, it's not a matter of indifference, and if choice is to be made in regarding to the cessation of operation or odoriferous fumes, Waukegan will prefer the latter, even though Lake Forest, with its multimillionaires, might favor the former. So intriguing insights there. Clearly the newspaper on an editorial run on page 2 is fully supporting the factory. They probably didn't call it an editorial. But it's quite clear that the paper thinks this is an important segment of the working population for Waukegan, for the business of Waukegan. Now, this is where, and again, Ty mentioned this at the beginning, the historical record, it comes and it goes. There's clearly some issues with pollution that flare up in 1901, and they don't ever really go away for the life of the factory. The next time it really flares up is 1906, and at that point, Lake Forest, which had been complaining for at least 5 years, according to the newspapers, actually filed a court injunction, a lawsuit, that resulted in a temporary shutdown of Waukegan, part of the Waukegan plant. That happened in 1906 in July. So again, the newspaper chimes in, and these are both, by the way, from the Waukegan Daily Sun. And you can see on the screen a headline, Waukegan waxes wroth at Lake Forest. This is quite a stinging article, an attack on Lake Forest, and again, I want to read you a little segment of that. It begins, the people of Waukegan are indignant over the hasty and ill-advised action of Lake Foresters and other luxury-loving North Shore residents in petitioning an injunction against the sugar refining plants of the Corn Products Refining Company. There is fear that the Corn Products Company will close down its main part here, and citizens express themselves as willing to take any measures to aid the workers of the sugar industry in Waukegan. Citizens appreciate the importance of the payroll and prestige that the plant brings the city. It is alleged against Lake Forest that while she has septic tanks, they do not treat sewage properly, and that in the matter of fact, their sewage is turning out more filth and impurity into the lake than Waukegan ever thought of doing. And then it continues to highlight that 155 men are out of work as a result of this lawsuit. You can also see the gloves have come off, so to speak, at least in terms of the Waukegan News Sun and these attacks from Lake Forest. And so the complexity of this situation is really something students can latch on to. You've got a social class issue here, truthfully, Waukegan being a working class city and getting upset with this Lake Forest lawsuit. But you have a real problem with pollution that it wasn't just Lake Forest that was complaining. As we've shown you, there's evidence and quite a substantial bit of evidence that says that the people in Waukegan were troubled by the pollution. And I think sometimes, we imagine kind of environmental concerns in the United States to be somewhat of a recent trend, but people are clearly concerned about it in the early 1900s, and I would say even before they knew of a lot of the health risks. They're seeing it as a nuisance, but I think they realized if the water was contaminated, that was problematic. So the students latch onto that, and that's part of what I get them to talk about as well as they study the sugar refinery. And this is something that really makes the story speak to them in a lot of ways, as many students today, and many of us, all of us today, are concerned about pollution from industry and coal, things of that nature.
So I'm going to go back a little bit to turn of century, 1900 or so, to pick up here kind of in the step-by-step process of the openings and closings of the sugar refinery. So really the segment that I'm covering right now, the things that Josh just talked about, that's something that the sugar refinery is dealing with, the pollution issue, but there's still other stuff going on as well. So from 1900 to 1902, the sugar refinery operated. But then in 1902, it did close. And it closed after it announced that there might be a merger between the Glucose Sugar Refining Company and the National Starch Company. And again, with this closure in 1902, it brought widespread unemployment to Waukegan and really hurt the economy. Within various times, the sugar refinery was putting $1,000 to $2,000 a day into workers' pockets. Now, today that doesn't sound like a lot, but for turn of the century, that's a lot of money that is now not that the workers just don't have. And then they're not spending it at other businesses, and the economy just starts to get worse and worse. But then reports start to come in of a new glucose factory coming to Waukegan. In fact, the United States Starch Works was bought, and this had been idle for years at this point. The new company was headed by a group led by C.M. Warner, so he was back at it again. Again, the former owner of the United States Sugar Refinery. Warner, though, decided that the U.S. Starch Works would be overhauled, and he turned it into a sugar refinery as well. And it opened in May 1903 as the Warner Sugar Refining Company. This did not make the corn products people who own the lower house or the sugar refinery very happy. Warner builds a 7-story building that becomes the tallest building in Waukegan at that time. So up to that point, the tallest building had been the second Lake County Courthouse, but now this one was taller. But in Waukegan, this was really seen with great joy because now the old sugar refinery was back up and running again. This new one, run by Warner, was operating as well, and Waukegan had the wire mill at the same time. So 3 major industries all working at the same time, lots of people employed. But some more problems happen. Specifically, on February 24th, 1904, at 6:23 p.m., a major explosion takes place at the Warner Sugar Refinery on that date. And, well, we know that there was little concern for workers' safety up to that point, and really by 1904, very little had changed. And this explosion was due to the spontaneous combustion in the starch machine in the powder house. So really still similar issues that they were having before with other explosions and fires. And this explosion really was huge. It's reported to have been felt in Wilmette and even in Long Grove. Windows were broken. Stove was knocked over in a Waukegan house, and many residents thought that it was an earthquake. Initially, it was reported that 50 had died. Thankfully, not that many did perish in this explosion, but still 4 did lose their life. And there were 8 others who had sustained major injuries. 6 buildings were destroyed, 5 more were damaged. Rail cars on the nearby track were destroyed too. And even adjacent companies, buildings next to the sugar refinery, they sustained heavy damage too. One was the Chicago House. This was a boarding house and sustained heavy damage after this explosion. It was owned by Elizabeth Stamberg, but she helped out the cause. She was making coffee, sandwiches for the men who were working at the site of the explosion that night after they were trying to clean things up and trying to recover any bodies, anybody that had been in that horrible blast. After the 1904 explosion, the Warner Sugar Refinery had to be closed for a period of time as it was rebuilding, but then it it does reopen. Things were fine for the next 2 years until the rumors started to spread about the sugar refinery closing yet again. By mid-February 1906, the rumors turned out to be true, and the Warner Sugar Refinery closed. Fears were that the plant was closed for good this time. But around the same time, other corn product plants were also closing around the Midwest. And if anything was going to reopen, it was going to be in Waukegan because Waukegan was the prime location. In 1906, the Warner Sugar Refinery and Corn Products Company merged. By 1907, most operations had been moved to the upper house, the newer buildings constructed by Warner.
So problems continue to plague the sugar refinery. It has a short history, but it has a troubled history. As late as 1911, the pollution problems that I spoke about earlier persisted. In 1911, there was another uprising, you could say, from residents in the city. This time, it was South Side homeowners and businessmen. They demanded a meeting with the mayor of Waukegan, city council, and management of the factory. At that meeting, they complained about the smoke, calling it a nuisance that was destroying their homes, destroying their quality of life. Also at the meeting, Charles Ebert, who was a superintendent at the factory, essentially threatened to move the factory elsewhere. I think his point of view is there had been complaints on probably an annual basis, even maybe even on a monthly basis, perhaps even more frequent than that. And it seemed the factory management was growing weary of handling the complaints, whether they be from residents of Waukegan or people in Lake Forest with lawsuits. So in any case, the representatives threatened to move the factory with further complaints. People had been applying pressure now, really since the factory had been operating, and Ebert and the refinery management threatened to move the factory elsewhere. However, there's not really all that much time for Ebert to ponder such a move, because in early 1912, in February, there was yet another explosion. And that's really what I think, eventually the factory closes down for good in 1912. It's not the February explosion that does it in, though. The factory had a history of safety issues. There's 3 major explosions, and as Ty mentioned, there's several other explosions and fires that perhaps we didn't get wind of from newspaper accounts. That doesn't include other fires that happened or anything else. It turns out that the 1912 explosions came at the apex of complaints from Waukegan and Lake Forest residents, and that ultimately would become a death blow to the factory. But I think it's important to remember other actors, and we've mentioned these individuals already, but I want to draw attention one more time to the largely immigrant labor force at these factories. I want these individuals to be remembered because I think to a great extent they were the biggest victims of the dangers of the factory. And I think a lot of, whether it was the newspaper or the cities, may have overlooked that group of people. As Ty mentioned with the 1904 explosion, both 1912 explosions were reported to be felt far away in not only neighboring communities, but communities 20 to 30 miles away. At one point when I read these articles with students, I thought that might have been an exaggeration, but with the unfortunate factory explosion we had in Waukegan last year, the silicone plant, that was felt and damaged property far and wide. So it turns out that if you get these large factories with dangerous conditions, they can do quite a bit of damage and be felt from far away. One of the most interesting things to me is the way the newspapers covered the events in detail. They showed up at the site, I think, within minutes of an explosion at times, and everybody rushed to the scene. Of course, you don't have television or anything like that, but people went to the site and started to describe the events in great detail. And I'd like to read some of those accounts to you. They're both from the scene and in the hospital. And as reporters arrived on the scene, they talk about some of the first people they find. The first two men who were found were discovered crawling in the cemetery. That would be Oakwood Cemetery, which was across, just west of the factory, across the railroad tracks and on top of the bluff. They were crawling in the cemetery, and they were found by Lloyd White of the firm White and Tobin. The men were crazed with pain and fright, and it took the combined effort of a half dozen men to secure them and take them to the hospital. The men were fighting and believed they were still in the burning building, and they were bending all efforts to make them make their way out. Not until they reached the hospital were the men restored to their right minds. Even now, it's feared that they will not live. These men were members of a gang working outside the plant who rushed in an effort to save others. How they got out is a mystery. Blankets from nearby houses were rushed to the scene, and man after man was taken from the ruins more dead than alive. Every ambulance in the entire city, all automobiles and carriages available were taken at once to the plant. One man following another were taken out until a total of over 21 were moved to the hospital. The furniture stores of the city were called upon, and rush orders for cots and bedding were filled. The hospital is filled to capacity at present, and the men injured in the accident are forced to take their places in the halls of the institution. It is expected that a number of those who are more seriously injured will die. The newspaper goes on to say this is the third time that the plant had blown up. Interesting that the numbers are conflicted here. The newspaper is claiming only 3. We think it's more than that. Once before, a few years ago, an accident of a similar nature occurred, and only last February, another building was blown to atoms. This wreck, however, was the worst of all. Apparently, the building was thrown into the air by terrific force in the explosion. Bricks were found for several blocks. The men have entirely forgotten their own danger in an effort to recover those who were burned amid the brick and burning wood. Man after man worked until he became exhausted, then was forced to give up his task. Not only the firemen, but also the citizens who were at the scene to rescue the men are getting control of the fire. And then I want to share one more with you, which shows the scene at the hospital. The hospital halls present a terrible scene. Men are lying on cots, half dead, moaning and crying in their agony and pain. Women of the neighborhood have given their assistance and are helping the regular nurses care for the injured. Half a dozen or more physicians are at the hospital working with feverish haste in an effort to save the lives of those who have a chance of living. Some, however, have been given up as lost, and they have had little possibility of living, and so small a spark of life that the physicians have abandoned them, and they are working on those whom they hope to save. So that is a pretty horrifying scene from the accident. The image there is taken just, I believe the headline on this said it was 15 minutes after the blast, so you can see fire crews working there on the building. So the second explosion in November of 1912 killed at least 14 people and injured dozens more. It is the deadliest industrial accident in Waukegan's history. Even after the explosions, the newspapers and many others in the city remained dedicated to keeping the factory operating here. The newspaper printed out a petition a few weeks later when they caught wind that the factory would likely not reopen, or there were some useful buildings that apparently had a little bit more product left, but the rumor was that there was going to be a closure that happened. So the Waukegan Daily Sun, again in 1912, printed out a petition and encouraged readers to sign it in an effort to keep the factory open. They referenced that shutting down the factory would put 660 people out of work. It would impact many other industries, particularly the railroad as well. So all of this death, destruction, and ruins of the factory dominated, I believe, played a big role in the decision to ultimately close the factory down.
So the last bushel of corn ground at the sugar refinery was on Monday, July 21st, 1913. So that's basically when the last of their supply was finally used. And that is the end of the sugar refinery in Waukegan. The area was eventually sold, and small factories leased parts of the buildings at the plant. The area became known as Manufacturers Terminal. Most of the original buildings, though, were destroyed by a fire in May of 1918, a fire that lasted for 3 days. Well, there you have it. The birth of Waukegan's industrial era with the saga of the sugar refinery. It is a story of many highs and lows, but the sugar refinery greatly impacted the growth and development of Waukegan, and it helped to transform it into an industrial hub. Hope you enjoyed that story on the sugar refinery today. Thank you again, Josh, for joining me, helping out with that, and all the insights that you have with it.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
So next week, no History Lunch and Learn, as we are prepping for our virtual Dandelion Wine Festival. And this is going to be on Saturday, June 13th. We hope that you can tune into that event. It'll be on Facebook Live. We will have it originally on the Waukegan Park District Facebook page, but also shared to the History Museum, to the Jack Benny Center for the Arts, and a few others. So hope you can find it. For this virtual festival, we will be doing a live marathon reading of Waukegan-born authors Ray Bradbury. So it's Bradbury's centennial year, and we have the great honor and privilege of helping to celebrate that by doing this live marathon reading. This was not the plan, of course, for the festival for this year, but we have had to adapt like so many others. But we know that if you're able to tune in, you will enjoy this reading of Dandelion Wine. We have celebrity readers coming in, celebrities like our very own Josh Bill, who will be reading a segment. So hope you can join. We'll start at 10 a.m. on Saturday, June 13th, and we'll go until 6 p.m. Hopefully we're done by then. So thanks again for joining us today. Josh, any last words?
Nope. I'm looking forward to the Dandelion Wine Virtual Festival.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. Like everything, we're making it up as we go. And, well, I look forward to talking about the past with you in the future. This is Ty Rohrer and Josh Bill signing off.